Hello, and thank you for joining today's session on value chain emissions in the finance industry, recommendations and pathways. I'm Cassandra Julin. I'm heading PR and communication at Normative, and I'm delighted to open this session at the Swedish Pavilion, where we are pioneering the possible. Thank you for joining us online, and thank you for joining us in person, everyone. Your Excellency and Honourable Member of the Parliament, business leaders and fellow climate champions, we are delighted to have you all here. So with that, the session is open, and let me welcome our first speaker on stage from Sweden, Your Excellency Johan Forssell, Minister for International Development, Cooperation and Foreign Trade.
Well, good day, everyone. I hope you're well. You seem to be doing very well, and that makes me very happy. And it's a pleasure to be here in the Swedish pavilion. And thank you for this opportunity to address all of you. And I'm glad to see so many prominent people here from different parts of society. We have a business, we have agencies, and we have some organizations too, I believe, and politics also. And I'm very glad for that, because climate change is truly something that affects all of us, all around the world in different parts of our societies. And that also underlines the importance of all sectors of our societies working together to address these challenges. And we are a government that truly believes in the power of entrepreneurship and more of innovation in doing business. And enabling businesses to minimize their emissions is really key for a more effective climate policy. But, and this is important, is also a great opportunity to strengthen our competitiveness, to build a more future-oriented economy, to create jobs, to create economic growth, etc. So we need more policies that accelerate the green transition for the people and the planet while spurring innovation, growth, and new jobs. And financial markets, they play a very critical role to this end. First, access to capital, of course. Innovators, entrepreneurs need access to more capital to develop all these new and modern and sustainable solutions and products, and also to fund the necessary research of tomorrow. Second, allocation of capital. We need to work with different tools to ensure that a fair share of market capital goes to green investments. So with support from authorities and research, we must step by step create better incentives for capital to go to green investments. And that is also something that we are addressing here at COP28, and that fills me with joy. And I have been asked to share a kind of a Swedish perspective in this field. So let me just briefly touch on some of the lessons from policies that we have implemented in Sweden. I believe today there is a large consensus around the need for improved data and increased transparency regarding climate risks. And these two fields are really guiding our action, which take place at several different levels. National financial incentives are targeted to accelerate the green transition in industry. For example, a specific credit guarantee for green investments in Sweden, something we believe a lot in. Sweden is truly a front-runner in sustainable finance in many ways. Its financial institutions have been some of the first active in the green bond market. Its research programs are widely covering the topic, and our development cooperation with both SIDA and also Swedfund are active in public partnerships for sustainable investments. And the Swedish government, we are increasingly striving to leverage our development and climate funding to mobilize other financial flows, because this is crucial. Because it is a fact that there are so many needs out there. We have the green transition, but we do also have the current situation in the Sahel region with great humanitarian needs. We do have the terrible war going on in Ukraine, etc. So it is a fact that ODA will simply not be enough. So we need to mobilize more of private capital, and I believe this was also the one of the most important takeaways from this year's UNGA meeting in New York. We need to do much more mobilizing private capital. And I also want in this field to mention the EU strategy Global Gateway, of course, in which Swedish companies can play a crucial role. And on the international level, Sweden is proud to be one of the countries pushing the topic of sustainable finance and the need to agree on common rules in this field. And as such, we are supporters of the EU strategy for financing the transition to a sustainable economy from 2021. At the same time, I also want to say that defining what is sustainable can also be a tricky task. And this might be controversial, but I think it's important because just a few years ago in Sweden, there was a big public discussion about several major banks and also some investment funds which decided to label defense industry as not sustainable. And I understand from their perspective what they did, but on the other hand side, of course, democracies like Sweden or United States or Finland must be able to defend themselves. I mean, just ask Ukraine if they think their weapons from Western producers are not sustainable. Well, of course they are, because they're using those weapons, those systems to defend their own freedom and democracy, and also the democracy and the freedom for Europe. So, yes, financial institutions can create good rules for the market to make investments more sustainable, but it's also important, I believe, not to create too narrow lines defining what is sustainable. So good market rules should focus on the aim to lower emissions, not exactly what type of companies or products are sustainable or not. And at the same time, broadening the scope outside the European Union, much more can and must be done for a better alignment of the different systems and jurisdictions. And we are committed to work to contribute to this work through continued dialogue between nations. So, my friends, to conclude, we all know that we must make a systemic shift of financial flows of all kinds. Public flows, private funds, national funds, global funds, in the direction of achieving the climate objectives and sustainable development goals. And we all know that capital mobilization is urgently needed to meet these objectives. And we all know that actors of the financial markets are well positioned to lead the effort to ensure access to and allocation of capital to enable a successful transition to a global net zero economy. So driven by both urgency, but also a lot of opportunities, Sweden stands very ready to continue to be your partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Forsell. Music to my ears to hear that we're steering capital towards more sustainable solutions. It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Honourable Member of the Parliament, Chris Skidmore.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak at the Swedish Pavilion this afternoon as the sort of UK's energy minister that signed our own commitment to net zero by 2050 into law back in 2019. I very much remember that Sweden's own net zero commitment was very much at the forefront of our minds. We were beginning to enter that sort of global net zero race. And I'm delighted that the UK and Sweden have continued to be climate leaders, not just in making overall commitments towards specific outcomes, but then to focus on the delivery and the implementation of those goals for the future. And it's when it's focusing on that question of delivery and implementation that I know many of us at COP28 will be focusing on what happens next. We've already seen key announcements around standardization, around ratcheting up ambition on integrity. Catherine McKenna has come out with her net zero standards, integrity matters, next stage projects to focus on business. We've seen Rachel Kite publish the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative standards, and we can see the direction that we're beginning to head in. And this is the direction I tried to focus on myself when I was asked by the UK government to lead a review of net zero. And I published this review, Mission Zero, that I brought out as a book for COP28 to look at how we can ensure not just that we meet our climate commitments, not just that we decarbonize further faster, but how we can also take business and industry with us. Because if we aren't able to all sail in the same direction, ultimately we will fail. We will not meet our targets. We have to ensure that we establish those new net zero markets that incentivize the flow of finance, as Minister Forsell outlined. And how we achieve this is by creating the right apparatus that works for business and industry. I often think we've done a fantastic job so far in financing, greening finance, setting out what's needed for the future, identifying how larger companies, the City of London, can become sustainable. What we need to now focus in on is how we finance green. How do we ensure that we unlock the blended finance for those projects that need help, need additional support, because we don't have the pricing mechanisms in place to unlock hydrogen, carbon capture, or simply just reducing emissions full stop. And to do that, we need to have the data to be able to benchmark, to be able to create the measures to hold companies to account. I'm delighted that Bankers for Net Zero is here, Heather Buchanan. They're working on a key project, Project Perseus, to understand how to produce this framework for the future. But at the same time, there's a wider message I think that we also need to embrace, which is the yes. We know what we need to achieve. We know what the overall outcome looks like. But for many small and medium-sized businesses who don't have the data to hand, they don't know necessarily what their Scope 3 emissions will look like, let alone their Scope 1 emissions. Providing that support is absolutely critical. So the review that I took forward for the UK government sort of set out a number of support mechanisms, not just through sort of tax credits, but through a Help to Grow Green initiative that would give SMEs that ability to be able to map out a future. And then secondly, also to recognize progress. Often we just focus solely on what excellent looks like, but we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We've got to be able to reward those industries, those SMEs that through no fault of their own, work in high carbon industries, in energy intensive industries, in concrete, in steel. And I know that sort of Sweden is a world leader now on focusing on green steel, both for the application of nuclear and hydrogen. It's important that when it comes to the regulatory apparatus, we don't over-complexify that ability to be able to use the technologies of tomorrow, but then using the technologies of today for those SMEs, creating a benchmarking and a standard that is flexible, recognizes and rewards those companies that have done the right thing. They may not have gone to absolute net zero straight away. Maybe they don't even know how to achieve that yet. We've got to be able to create a sense of a charter mark that rewards progress, whether that's bronze, silver, gold, and we set that out in the Mission Zero review. I know that when it comes to focusing on supply chains, as I said, somebody else's Scope 1 emissions is somebody else's Scope 3 emissions. We're all in this together. And above all, we need to recognize that we can't do this individually as nations. The UK has gone through a difficult path leaving the European Union. As a result, its emissions trading scheme is divergent from that of the EU. We now need to focus, taking the politics out of the transition, because ultimately carbon dioxide knows no borders, to return to a pathway where we have the ability to cooperate, because we have the ability to work together on common frameworks, common means of accounting, common data standards as well. I hope that the discussion we're about to have will map out a pathway for how we can achieve this in the future. But to end, the UK is a good friend of Sweden's. We've looked to Sweden as an exemplar in the past on how to achieve a net zero pathway, and I'm sure we will continue to work and collaborate together on how we can provide the benchmarks for both Swedish and British businesses for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member of the Parliament, Chris Skidmore, for your contributions. I agree, I love to see the collaboration between Sweden and UK going forward, and I hope Mr. Forsell and Mr. Skidmore, you have a lot to talk about. But with that, let's move to our next agenda point. It's the businesses doing the work that will get up on stage next. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Dr. Alexander Schmidt, who's heading Science, Sustainability and Climate Research at Normative. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, and thank you to the first two keynotes, which honestly, I think we couldn't have asked for more in terms of setting the scene. I was almost afraid to take away too many of our panelists' talking points already, but I think it was a very nice warm-up for what is to come. And what is to come are four panelists that I would like to invite now on stage. Let's start with you, Christian. Christian Runs, CEO and co-founder of Normative. Heather, if you will come up next. Heather Buchanan, Chief Executive and co-founder, Bankers for Net Zero. We also have with us Frances Malish from EBRD, Managing Director of F4 Financial Institutions. And virtually with us, very glad that she could make it, is Anja Hannes from Nordea, Group Head of Sustainability. And she's dialing in remotely from the office in Stockholm. So welcome also, Anja, to you. We're going to experiment a bit with how we best integrate, of course, the studio guest, but I'm sure we can make it work and have her on screen as well. That would be brilliant. Let us start pretty much where the keynotes have left off. And just there's Anja. Thank you so much. Good morning, Anja, for you in Stockholm. Great. So let's kick it off. Christian, if you wouldn't mind opening up a bit the scene. So we heard a lot about the role of, especially, of course, on Finance Day, financial institutions. We recently brought out a white paper together with, among others, Bankers for Net Zero, and we sketched a bit the idea of proactivity. Can you just kind of reiterate this for us? Why is being proactive, why does it pay off?
I think we have to remember that net zero, it's not a short sprint, it's a marathon. And embedded into every single global value chain is a significant risk that is not properly internalized into the profit and loss statement of businesses. So if you take any business, 90% on average will be located in their Scope 3 value chain. And right now we're actually in a situation, and you did most of that study, but we looked at enterprises and the net zero commitments of enterprises and what it amounts to. Turns out that approximately 970, enterprises with net zero commitments, listed companies, they add up to almost 80% or 78% of global emissions. And I just want that to sink in. Like, if enterprises succeed with their net zero commitments, we all succeed collectively. But almost all of that emissions is located in Scope 3. And you don't reorient your value chains on a dime. Some of these value chains can take like years or even decades. So carbon taxes will be screwed on. That creates a big risk. Market mechanisms are being implemented, as we just heard the two previous speakers talk about. So I think proactivity is of the absolute essence in order to have a good business going forward. And I will just end with one quick analogy. I think the question all businesses need to ask themselves is, do we want to be like Blockbuster, or do we want to be like Netflix? The green transition is happening. We can't negotiate with nature. And if you don't adapt quick enough, and that's exactly what happened with Blockbuster, with digital technology, you will go bust. There will be winners and losers in this race, and you're way more likely to win if you're proactive.
Thank you so much, Christian. And you already touched a bit upon the market and also the role of governance. Heather, I would love you to come in here a bit more. So assuming, we have the baseline set, but what about governments? Like, what's the role there? What about effective compliance? What can you say about that role?
Certainly, and I think, if you don't mind, I'll kind of back up a bit and stuff, and I'll give everybody my fun fact. So 1494 was our first book on modern accounting. And so to Christian's point about kind of internalizing things, so we've had just over 500 years to get to a point where we have risk and value determined, and it's been the bottom line, hasn't it? And at no point along that way has nature or carbon or anything else actually been on that balance sheet or whatnot. And so our entire perception of what risk and value is changing in a matter of years rather than centuries. And that's a big ask of everybody. And so whilst we see kind of businesses, and I would say, COP26, the commitments that a lot of the largest businesses in the world and the financial institutions in the world made at COP26 were absolutely a game changer in terms of kind of starting to move that ship, as it were. But everything, our processes, our laws, everything is set up for a different value system right now. And so that kind of interaction and that level of kind of collaboration that's required to kind of turn the ship at the pace that we need it to turn, and take less than 500 years to get to the next stage, because we don't have that, is absolutely critical. And I think that's one of the kind of key takeaways that certainly at Bankers Net Zero, that's kind of our, value statement, is kind of that kind of deep collaboration where you have to kind of, you need to get finance, you need to get business, you need to get government, and you need to get regulators in a room and say, right, we're fundamentally changing everything, rather than business and finance being the receivers of regulation and whatnot. It's much more of a cooperative shift to make, because we haven't tried this before, as it were, and so you don't really want to kind of just go off experimenting too much, so yes.
Couldn't agree more. And you mentioned collaboration. I mean, that's part of why we're all here, and also why we're all here on stage, and also why we work together with Nordea, for example. So I would love to bring in Anja here. Can you shed some more light on how applied, like collaboration applied, looks like in the context of Nordea sustainability work?
Sound working?
Oh, I think we lost Anja here. Let us quickly then just continue in this studio here while we see how we can get Stockholm online again. So maybe actually, Francis, you wouldn't mind stepping in, and sorry for having you separated here a bit on stage, but to continue pretty much with Anja's talking point, because obviously EBRD, you also work very much applied on the topic. So how does it look like when you work together with the banks? How does also the topic of financed emissions come in, which we haven't explicitly mentioned yet?
Well, it is a tricky point, I must say. EBRD works with corporates, with infrastructure, and with the financial sector. The financial sector work is around 45% of our investments every year. And we work with around 350 partner banks in our 36 countries of operations. So this is primarily an SME operation, because when you look at the economy of most of our countries of operations, there's very few large corporates, the kind that produce like the cement and steel and so on, that we focus on when we look at the net zero commitments. But still, our partner banks finance 1 million SMEs a year, right? And for them, the data is a big challenge. And Scope 3 is very important for us because it's too easy to reduce your carbon footprint by selling it, right? Removing it from your balance sheet, but not from the atmosphere, right? And that applies to banks as it applies to corporates. And when I see, for example, let me give you just a small anecdote. I was recently, a few months ago, in southern Kazakhstan, all right, in the countryside, working with a microfinance institution, and we went visit a farmer. So growing tomatoes and cucumbers under greenhouses. No mystery that the winters can be harsh in Kazakhstan, so you need to heat up the greenhouses. What do you do it with? Turns out it was coal. And turns out this farmer had actually decided to move to natural gas. Why? Just en passant, because Europe had actually purchased all of the coal, and it had become too expensive because we wanted to wean ourselves off Russian gas, so we took the coal from the Kazakhs. Now, that's a way to foster global warming in emerging markets, is to make the coal too expensive because we use it for ourselves. I'm not sure the credibility that it gives us to preach to them afterwards. But the point is, though, with that bank, what do? Do you finance the move to natural gas, knowing that for the next 4 or 5 years, probably this farmer is going to continue polluting with gas instead of polluting with coal? My answer is yes, we should, because coal is much worse, and because when you drive around that area of southern Kazakhstan, you see a pile of the black stuff at the back of literally every single greenhouse. Now, for SMEs, the issue we have is that there's no reliable data. There's already lack of reliable data in many Western European countries, but then talk about, subsistence farming, talk about the economy in those countries that have not had the chance to pollute their way into prosperity like we have had. There is a much bigger challenge there in terms of getting to data and reliability. And so we need to work with these 350 partner financial institutions to get there. And we also need to work with their regulators. Because otherwise what's going to happen is the bank that pioneers this and says to its clients, if you don't have your CO2 footprint, I'm not going to finance you, it's just going to lose market share. That's a losing proposition. The moment the regulator says, any financing in my country, you need the CO2 certificate, and there are providers in the country, then you build the virtuous ecosystem where companies get their certificate, banks can ask the companies to use it, and then you can start differentiating the pricing. Just like when you measure the biodiversity, there's technology now that allows you to measure biodiversity. Then if you measure it, then you can price it. So that's the challenge.
Yeah. So currently there are, especially you mentioned SMEs. The SMEs really are at the heart of the challenge. Heather, I mean, that's of course a topic that you can speak to very, very well due to your work. Maybe you want to quickly enlighten us a bit how you perceive the SME challenge or the SME kind of realm, and also the importance in the whole decarbonization transition.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, so first and foremost, when you look at the large corporates and financial institutions, there's a wee line of commitments. We're going to, certainly for banks, decarbonize our financed emissions by 2050. And it's a small line there, but actually, most people don't really kind of realize it means that banks and financial institutions need to understand and get to decarbonization point of every mortgage, every single overdraft, every small business loan, no matter what the size, and every corporate and the corporate's entire supply chain. And that is a kind of an exercise that's never, on a scale that's never been taken before. And people always ask me, can't banks kind of get there faster? And I always say, well, absolutely. We could have all of our banks be net zero by next year as long as they, got rid of all of their customers. And then, but then, as we know, then you just end up shifting the problem, because you can, as you say, you can take carbon off the balance sheet of a financial balance sheet, but you can't take it off Earth's balance sheet. And so it goes elsewhere. So that kind of level of interaction and support for SMEs is absolutely critical. And it's a really tough, difficult journey, because everybody says they've got nothing in common, they're time poor, there's very mixed messaging out there. There's not even a global standard in terms of a nice, simple way of reporting. So we really are kind of I would say, flying the plane as we build it. And all of the kind of standards that we've had up to now have been very, very top down. And so you end up with these gold-plated reporting standards, and we're trying to kind of chip away the gold, as it were. So what we're certainly doing with Project Perseus and the work that we're doing with as the SME advisory group for the Transition Plan Task Force is to step back and say, well, actually, let's just work from the bottom up. So, what are the absolute basic material data points we need? How can we automate those as much as possible? And that's where, obviously, the work that we're doing with Project Perseus and Normative comes in. And just provide that kind of simple support so that rather this kind of top-down pressure onto shifting sands, we get a bit more stability. Otherwise, we won't get there.
True, that's true. And Anja, you have luckily not decided to get rid of all of your customers, but you have taken the problem in a different way. Second try, can you share a bit insights into how Nordea works with their business banking customers?
Yes, thank you, Alex. I hear a lot of important things in this panel when we talk about collaboration and also maintaining the competitiveness of also small and medium-sized companies in this transition. I think it's super important. And we in Nordea, we have different approaches for how we address our large corporates and institutions and the small and mid-sized companies and also our private individuals. But first of all, we need to consider that that our customers are in different stages of the transition, so they need different kinds of support. The relative progress in the transition is as important, I think, as reaching the final steps towards the finish line. So that's where we think that we as a bank can have a really important role. Secondly, then, of course, the size of the company is key, since in general the larger corporates have better access to good quality data. They have more experience from reporting than the smaller size companies. So there we can support with tools and also guidance and training to our customers to help them in their transition. Then thirdly, I think we need also to consider the complexity of the different ESG factors and how they interrelate to each other. So when we work with climate transition, we need to also consider, it was mentioned before, biodiversity and also social aspects of the transition. And this is the way we can really create a win-win, because we can help the customers reduce their own risk, their transition risks that they are exposed to. We can reduce our own risk in Nordea at the same time, so we are better for our investors to get the capital we need to be an important player in the transition. And this way we also have a positive impact on society. So when it comes to our customers, employees and the local societies where they act, we can also have a positive impact there. So there are a lot of different ways we can work with our customers here. But I would also just like to say that for us as a bank, it's of course also important to consider the total impact of our portfolio. So we need to make sure we have a diversified portfolio, that we work with different geographies and different sectors. We need to have the relevant competence to be able to guide our customers and really be a trusted partner to them in this transition. We need to work together, and I think we can achieve a lot of good things. And we see that now that we're getting the data from also smaller customers and working with models to scale up, to cover portfolios, that the monitoring of relative progress is also so important. So I think we have come a long way, but there's of course still so much more that we can do in this space.
Thank you, Anja. I mean, this sounds very encouraging on one hand. On the other hand, it also sounds like a huge challenge. There's a lot to tackle. Christian, can you help us to tie these different both challenges, but also, as we heard already, some openings for solutions there. Can you help us to tie them a bit together and give us a bit of a picture of what are the biggest bottlenecks on the pathway to being a proactive player in the financial industry?
So I think I want to step back to something that Heather said. Standardized accounting was invented 600 years ago. It was sort of standardized globally somewhere between 150 years ago. It was digitized maybe 30 years ago. We need to do all of that for carbon accounting in just a couple of years. And what worries me is the integrity of the entire system, right? If you take an average bank, 99.9% of emissions are in the financed emissions category. You can't just remove all of the customers from the balance sheet. The only way of getting the job done is to actually get real activity-based data from the client. That is literally the only way of doing it. So that's why we at Normative, for the past few years, and we just launched what we call Carbon Network, because we need this exchange, seamless exchange of carbon data between the SMEs and the banks. So you can, in fact, track what are the emissions of the overall portfolio. And you also need to work together with the advisors. Can we finance part of that transition together with our clients? And I think Chris was very kind enough to point out that Sweden is leading in net zero. But I think I want to commend you, Heather, and the wonderful work you're doing with Bankers for Net Zero and the Perseus project. I think the standardization of getting activity level data from SMEs has to happen. And hopefully you are creating a model that can be copy-pasted in the rest of the world and Sweden alike, because there's no other way of doing this than to have that seamless data exchange, but actually incentivize actions based on the data. I mean, that is what the regulation is for, to really create the framework that incentivizes action.
Francis, I see you nodding along when it comes to data and SME, of course, SME's exchange of SME data.
And I fully agree. I just don't think that we are going to bring all of our countries to that level in the next 2 years, because there's a lot of way to go. But however, I think when we survey our clients, and we do it from time to time, they do tell us that they need technical assistance. It's not a lack of will. They want to go down that path, but they need the support. And so if there's a solution that exists for Sweden, and we can roll it out in poorer countries so that the cost of implementing the solution is ideally higher than the revenue of that client, which is a problem in some countries, then we can make them leap forward. And we are going to have clients, just like banks in Tajikistan use AI for credit decisions. Why can they have more advanced tools to measure their emissions? So of course we pioneer those tools with our own financing lines. I think the big challenge is not so much the funding that we, BRD, give to these clients, is the moving that at the scale of their own balance sheet, right? Again, a statistic, the EBRD finance in any banking sector in any of our countries of operations is somewhere between 0.5% of that banking sector and 3% of that banking sector. So if you manage to make that switch from the financing that we give to the financing that the banks give, you have a 30 to 300 or 200 times impact in terms of the emissions. So it's crucial, and it's crucial that the people with the most advanced solutions are willing to share them for the greater good of all of us. We work in a bottom pile of countries, and that is where a lot of effort is needed. We won't achieve the green transition if those countries don't do it.
How would you just stick with you for Anja? Anja, do you want to comment on this one quickly? Please go ahead.
No, I really appreciate that comment, and I think that the standardization and the collaboration here is so important, also to create more transparent disclosures and mitigate greenwashing. So the more of us using the same standards for reporting, calculating finance emissions, the better quality and the better understanding we can provide for customers and investors around the state of things. So I really welcome more cross-country, cross-industry collaboration in this work.
That does already sound like part of the topic of our panel, the pathway forward, right? That sounds like, Anja, this would be your recommendation for a pathway forward. Is anything else comes to mind from your Nordea's point of view, how the pathway forward looks like, or is this kind of your conclusion?
No, I think that's what we need to do now to really scale up, and we have a lot of regulations coming, and that of course affects us as a bank, and we don't want to be stuck in the reporting. We really want to be there for our customers, support them in the transition, and the data work is of course key here, and it's of course about collecting data, calculating finance emissions, but also about modeling for the portfolios where we don't have access to customer data, and then bringing the sort of reputation of data to a more positive light. Like, what can we use good data for, also for customers? What kind of insights does that bring to their operation? How can they develop their strategy, stay competitive, also compared to bigger players who are then in scope of more firm regulations? So I think the work with data and the power access to good data really means that's I think something we need to just increase even more going forward.
Yeah, and I think this echoes very well, Francis, what you said as kind of the recommendation forward. Maybe as closing, Heather and Christian, the pathway forward, Heather, from your point of view, what does this entail?
Collaboration, and collaboration. So just for kind of, I guess, a bit of perspective on the Perseus project, we've got a huge group of all the trade bodies in the UK. We've got international observers. We've had over 150 people working on it for 4 months just to get to the point of a demonstrator. And all that effort is for one data point. To actually get one data point assurable, and that's electricity. And so once we get that, then we'll go into the next data point and the next data point. But it is, the level of collaboration it's taken just to get to that point for one has been extraordinary, and it could not have happened any other way.
Last comment, Christian, your pathway forward?
I would agree with Heather. We need collaboration, but that collaboration can happen throughout networks. I mean, we need first and foremost reliable exchange of data. So we get activities-based data between SMEs and the large banks. But the flow of data is not the only thing. I think the flow of specific asks and actions, like we would want you to, for instance, switch to renewable electricity, install solar power, electrify your vehicle fleets. And as a matter of fact, we are going to be a part of financing that transition under more favorable conditions.
And in this spirit of collaboration, I would love to now thank you all panelists and also the previous speakers for this enlightening conversation. It was at least a 4-country collaboration, I believe. I look at nationalities. So if I may ask all the speakers and panelists up on stage for a final picture, and thank you the audience for dialing in as well for a very engaging conversation on the topic.